Alright, so we are starting the unit on the cardiovascular system. The major function of the cardiovascular system is to transport oxygen, nutrients around the body, and to also remove waste. Without this function, cells would die. There are two types of circulation that we are going to be looking at in the cardiovascular system, and they are the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation. So systemic delivers blood to all of the body and carries away waste, whereas the pulmonary is the one that eliminates carbon dioxide and oxygenates the blood. So first, a little bit about the heart. It is located within the mediastinum, a space between the lungs, backbone, and sternum, between the second rib and the fifth intercostal space. The heart is about fist-sized, and in an adult it can weigh 300 grams. It's an organ that has, a wider top, and then it has a tip at the bottom. The bottom, or the tip of the heart, is called the apex. The way we learned it in EMT class is that the apex is the tippy of the organ, but not necessarily the top. So it's the tip of the organ, which just happens to be inferior in this case, in the body. There are various membranes that cover the heart, called the pericardium. There is, it's fibrous. The pericardium encloses the heart, and it has two layers. So the two layers of the pericardium are the visceral pericardium, which is the inner part, and the parietal pericardium, which is the outer part. And it also has the pericardial cavity, and within the pericardial cavity there's fluid, and it does the same thing that it does when we're talking about the nervous system. There's that liquid layer that protects the brain. The pericardial cavity has fluid that reduces friction. So beyond the pericardium, or underneath the pericardium, we have the wall of the heart. And the wall of the heart has three layers as well. The first layer is the epicardium, and that is the outer layer. Its main function is to reduce friction. Then you have the myocardium. If you remember from the muscle unit, myo would be the root for that. And it is the middle layer, and it's mostly made of cardiac muscle. Then you have the endocardium, which is the smooth inner lining of the heart chambers and valves. So furthest in, endocardium. Your heart also has chambers and valves. So first of all, the heart is sort of like a double pump. The circulation has a double circuit going through it. Pulmonary being one of them, so that's when the blood is traveling to the lungs and then back. And then your systemic, so we're going back to that stuff we talked about at the beginning, where the blood travels to the body and then back again. So there's two systems going on. The heart has four chambers, so it has the atria, which are at the top. And so two atria, two ventricles. The upper portion, of course called the atria, are separated by an intraatrial septum. And the atria receive blood from veins. It's a passive process, and they are thin-walled chambers. The lower chambers are called the ventricles, and they are separated by an intraventricular septum, and the ventricles pump blood from the heart into the arteries. So it's more active, so it is a thick-walled chamber with muscle. And those are the 4 chambers of the heart. So the ventricles receive blood from the atria above them, and then they pump the blood out of the heart through different arteries. The main ones here being the pulmonary artery and the aorta. All right, then you have your valves, and there are 4 valves that we're going to talk about. There are your AV valves, which are your arterioventricular valves, and your semilunar valves. First, atrioventricular valves, AV. You have the tricuspid valve, which lies between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And then you have the bicuspid valve, which lies between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Important structures with these valves are the chordae tendineae. They are tendon-like fibrous cords, and they connect to the cusps, the flaps of the AV valves, and it connects them to the papillary muscle, so of the ventricles. And the whole point of this is to prevent the cusps from swinging back into the atria. So it's keeping them from going back into the atria. So papillary muscle is muscular columns located on the inner surface of the ventricles. So you have the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles connected, keeping those valves from going back into the atria. Then there are the semilunar valves, the SL valves. There's a pulmonary one that lies within the pulmonary trunk, and there is an aortic one, semilunar valve, that lies within the aorta. So it is, when you're looking at the heart, when you see the pulmonary trunk, that's where you're going to find the pulmonary semilunar valve. So they are named based on location, which kind of makes it easy. So reminder that the flaps of the valves are called cusps. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is how blood is going to flow through the heart, and that's really the last part of this video. We're going to talk about how that goes down. So we will look at a picture of the heart. Alright, so we have that right here. So here you have deoxygenated blood entering from the superior vena cava. So it is coming from the head and upper limbs. That's where the superior vena cava gets the blood from. The inferior vena cava gets it from the trunk and the lower limbs. And it's going to bring blood into the right atrium right here. Then that blood is going to go through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And it's going to go through the pulmonary valve, which you remember is one of the semilunar valves. And that is going to go to the pulmonary artery. So this is a pulmonary trunk. And that is going out to the lungs. So that is pumping blood away from the heart. And then it's going to return in through the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins is going to return into the left atrium. And then it's going to go through the bicuspid valve right here into the left ventricle. And the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, where it's going to go several different directions, which we will be addressing later.
Mr. Fulgham, could you please call the office? Mr. Fulgham?
And that is the basic blood flow through the heart. So one thing that I didn't talk about in this picture is the blood supply to the heart. And that is done through the left coronary, or through the coronary arteries. So you have the ascending aorta. It's going to go out of the ascending aorta, and then it is going to go to the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. And then it's going to go to the capillaries, cardiac veins, coronary sinus, and then back to the right atrium. So there's a kind of a separate path for blood supply to the heart. Okay, so the skeleton of the heart, so you have dense, regular connective tissue, and that's going to form rings around the 4 valves, and it forms masses in the interventricular septum. So this also provides attachment sites for the valves and cardiac muscles. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. We already talked about that when we looked at the pulmonary artery. It was going away. The aorta, which is an artery, is going away from the heart. So they carry blood that is high in O2, so oxygen, and low in carbon dioxide, with the exception of the pulmonary artery. So if you remember from the picture, the pulmonary artery still had the deoxygenated blood, and it has to carry it to the lungs away from the heart. So while it's still moving away from the heart, it has blood that is low in O2 and high in carbon dioxide. The aorta carries the blood from the left ventricle to the body, and the pulmonary arteries carry the blood from the right ventricle to the lungs. And the coronary arteries carry blood to the myocardium. If you remember from the layers of heart that we talked about earlier, the myocardium was that middle part that was mostly cardiac muscle. Veins carry blood away, veins carry blood toward the heart. So the ones that we talked about, the superior vena cava, bringing it from the head and upper limbs, and the inferior, bringing it from the trunk and lower limbs. Then you have the coronary sinus, which is bringing the blood from the myocardium. And then pulmonary veins, which are bringing the blood from the lungs, where the pulmonary artery pushed it to, back into the left atrium, where it will go to the left ventricle and then be distributed throughout the body from the aorta. Another interesting thing about hearts is heart sounds. So they have the lub-dub, and that is basically, the lub is the closing of the AV valves, and the dup is the closing of the semilunar valve. So it has both of those. So when the AV valves close, that's ventricular systole. When the semilunar valves are closing, that is ventricular diastole. Sorry. And if you have leaks between these valves, it's going to lead to a heart murmur, which if you listen with a stethoscope, that's going to sound like a swishing sound instead of your typical lub up. And that is all for the first video.